The time has flown by. It's now nearly 29 years since Pete Rose broke the all-time hit record of Ty Cobb at Riverfront Stadium. Nothing seemingly could go wrong from the kid in Western Hills in those days until 4 years later. It's going to be 25 years ago this August that Pete was banned from baseball for betting. He's been on the outside ever since. Many books and articles have been written about Pete ever since. Pete also wrote one for himself, the latest, Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. Kostya Kennedy is the author, and he's with us now. When I saw this, I'm thinking, oh, not another book about Pete Rose, but where did you see, was the timing right, or had the subject matter changed in a way that made this the right time?
You know, I think the answer is yes to both of those questions. I think Pete has changed. You know, it has been 25 years, as you said, and it's been 10 years since he admitted to betting on baseball, and he's not the same man that he was a few years ago. You sense that there's a feeling in him. I don't want to say that he's necessarily contrite or sorry, but he understands that this is his bed that he made. You know, he'll be 73 in a couple of weeks, and he knows what time it is, and he knows where he's at. So there's been a lot of life that's been led that has changed the story. And the story as well has changed around him, given the whole steroid era in baseball, given some of the changes around how we view baseball players and our sports stars and all that. So it's a different environment in many ways.
Okay, you know all these other books have been written, so how do you feel you had to attack this?
Right.
Was it different sources, different people, a different way of seeing Pete?
Well, again, I think you've touched on a few different things. You know, I guess there's two things in every book. It's what you're saying and the way you're saying it. So I certainly found a lot of new stuff, and I went back and spoke with people who were teammates, of course, of Pete, and also with John Dowd and Faye Vincent and people on every side of this issue as far as that went. And there's also, you know, when you see other books, every book has its own merit. I didn't want a book that was going to be necessarily pro-Pete or anti-Pete, but a look at this real dilemma. So that when I've had people say, oh, I go back and forth on Pete 5 times when I read this book. and that's great for me, I think. You know, he is such a compelling character, and to be at this stage in his life and the arc, the narrative of his life, and to see where he is, it's really an original American life.
How did you Pete? I mean, the story, obviously. Had you ever covered him as a player, manager, or anything like that?
I really got to know Pete a little bit the first time I spent any extended time with him. I did a previous book on Joe DiMaggio. It's called 56. And I went to spend some time with Pete, who had, he hit in that 44 straight, of course, in 1978, and he knew Joe. And I went out to Vegas, where Pete was working, signing autographs, and I sat beside him just like this for about 5 hours. And 5 hours right next to him. And Pete was great, and we talked about a lot of different things. And there was something, this was about 2010, and there was something unresolved about Pete. There was something unresolved, too, in the way that people interacted with him. It wasn't, you know, in the field I'm in, you're around a lot of different Hall of Fame type players and that, and it was different. Certainly there was an adoration of him. There's also a little bit of trepidation being around him, and the unknown always kind of lurks around Pete.
Yeah. When he accepted the ban, do you think he thought it was temporary? Do you think that 25 years later he figured he was still going to be in this situation? No. I
don't think that he figured that at all. You know, it was really poorly handled, and there is a clause in there that says after 1 year you can apply for reinstatement. And it seemed like they overvalue that a great deal, because that's in every single clause in baseball. If you're banned after a year, you can. Pete's biggest mistake was that he should have, right from the beginning, said, all right, you guys, you got me, and apologized and agreed to stop gambling and come clean and work. If he had done that, he could be managing the Reds today.
And you got that from John Dowd as well. I mean, it's a very good source.
Oh, there's no question. When baseball went into this, I mean, they loved Pete. You know, he was such a great ambassador for the game, and he who couldn't love Pete? And they were rooting for him to get through this. But they stonewalled, and baseball really had no choice. Baseball really had no choice but to ban Pete Rose. I mean, it wasn't really, the evidence was so overwhelming that there was nothing they could do but ban him. And then, you know, the way things transpired and went after that, it really is, that's why we're here 25 years later. And I don't think Pete, I think when he first had the press conference, he really thought in a year I'm going to be getting back in that dugout and being Pete Rose on the ball field again.
I want to ask you if you have any trouble with this, because I think a lot of people do. Is the sin of Pete Rose different than the sin of Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens or the other guys that are Mark McGwire, that sort of thing?
You know, John, they're different in that, so what Pete did in betting on baseball, the reason why that's the cardinal rule is because if I'm a keeper of the game, and it's amazing, I should say, how often 1919 came up in researching this book. It's 95 years ago now. You're aware that if somebody gambles on the game, and if there's any sense that the outcome might be compromised, you could lose your fans. You can lose business. Well, baseball knows the fans are still going to come out to see guys who are juiced up on steroids. They have. So from a pure marketing business standpoint, that's one reason why it's so much worse. And it's also because of the integrity of the game on the gambling, but that was also, of course, impacted by steroids. There are two sins against the game. There's no question about it. And I think that one way to look at it is that what Pete did could have been so much more dangerous, but it was stopped and it wasn't. And the danger of steroids, such as it is, was seen. We saw it rewrite the record book, and we saw the way it impacted careers and pennant races. So they're different, but they also fall in this general sort of feeling about how fans have in terms of protecting baseball.
You were signing at Joseph Beth today, so you're dealing and engaging with Cincinnati baseball fans. Do they bring up different elements and just say and want to know your opinion and give you their opinions as well?
No question, and it's a pleasure actually being here in Cincinnati and meeting people, and I love engaging on all fronts. People always have, there are some things you hear repeatedly, but often somebody will have a new thought or a new take. A lot of people have met Pete here and there and all that, and they have things. So it's a great sort of exchange of ideas is really what it is. And Pete is really, the other thing I would say in terms of what led to the book and Pete, a lot of times he's sort of a caricature of himself. He had this comic book nickname, Charlie Hustle, and what a great player. And then he gambled the big fall, and then he's kind of the butt of jokes for a long time with his involved with pro wrestling and all that. But Pete is a pretty nuanced, layered guy when you get past the original, you know, Pete being Pete. And that comes through a little bit in some of the discussions I've been able to have with Cincinnati.
Okay, then let me ask you a follow-up with that Pete was told to reconfigure his life 25 years ago. Do you think he's finally accepted what reconfigure meant?
Well, he says that he has, and you know, reconfigure, and I think one of the reasons that Fay Vincent and Bart Giamatti like the term is that it's not very specific.
No, it isn't.
It can mean something to you and something to me and something to Pete. I have no reason to think he's still best on baseball, and he doesn't have the cast of characters around him, certainly, that he did 25 years ago. He hasn't had that for a long time. But he still will, you know, I've been right around him when he's betting on the horses, and he'll still gamble, and he sets up shop in Vegas because that's where he can do business. That's okay for you and me. That's okay for a lot of people. It's okay for Pete. There's nothing wrong with it. It's legal. But it's not the best idea if you're looking to change your image in the eyes of baseball and the Hall of Fame and people like that. So his life has certainly changed, and it has been reconfigured in some sense, but it's not completely reconfigured.
When Bud Selig quits being commissioner in another year or so, do you think his situation will be looked at again? Do you think at least there'll be some consideration given? You point out the dilemma. This dilemma is not going to go away for a long time.
You know, there's two things, John. One is the ban from baseball, and that is in the hands of a commissioner, of course. But there's also the ban from the Hall of Fame, and these are separate issues. And whether or not Pete gets reinstated in the game or gets eligible to be voted on in the Hall of Fame needn't be twinned. They are, you know, when Pete was banned in 1989, he was as eligible as anybody else for the Hall of Fame. Joe Jackson had been eligible for 55 years, and it was only 2 years later that the Hall of Fame quickly made up a rule They were worried that Pete might get in. So I think that's a change we could and should see, which is let's open it up. Let's allow the voting for the Hall of Fame. If Pete had fair voting for the Hall of Fame, he might get in, he might not. There are people who feel a lot of different ways about him, but that's something that could change, and I think that is more likely to happen or more realistic than somebody saying, all right, Pete's back in the game, because then he might go coach somewhere. I don't think he'd get a manager's job at this point, but he could coach somewhere or something like that, which might make people uneasy, rightfully or not, in baseball.
You're good. Hey, I look forward to reading this.
Oh,
Thanks
my
for
pleasure.
coming to town.
Thanks so much.
When we come back, it's another outstanding book about baseball, all about the local guys who have played for the Reds. This is the eve of opening day. It looks like the weather's going to be perfect. It hasn't always been like that. The wildest opening day of